papyrus of the earliest Theban dynasties. 66. As papyrus, being in great demand, and exported to all parts of the world, became very costly, other materials were often used instead of it, among which is mentioned leather, a few leather mills of an early period having been found in the tombs. 64. Parchment, using sheepskins left after the wool was removed for cloth, was sometimes cheaper than papyrus, which had to be imported outside Egypt. With the invention of wood pulp paper, the cost of writing material began a steady decline. Wood pulp paper is still used today, and in recent times efforts have been made in order to improve bond strength of fibers. Two main areas of examination in this regard have been dry strength of paper and wet web strength. 67. The former involves examination of the physical properties of the paper itself, while the latter involves using additive to improve strength. Uses and implications of writing. Writing and the economy. According to Denise Schmidt-Bisserat, writing had its origins in the counting and cataloguing of agricultural produce, and then economic transactions involving the produce. 68. Government tax rolls followed thereafter. Written documents became essential for the accumulation and accounting of wealth by individuals, the state, and religious organizations, as well as the transactions of trade, loans, inheritance, and documentation of ownership. 69. With such documentation and accounting, larger accumulations of wealth became more possible, along with the power that accompanied wealth, most prominently to the benefit of royalty, the state, and religions. Contracts and loans supported the growth of long-distance international trade with accompanying networks for import and export, supporting the rise of capitalism. 70. Paper money, initially appearing in China in the 11th century CE, 71, and other financial instruments relied on writing, initially in the form of letters and then evolving into specialized genres, to explain the transactions and guarantees, from individuals, banks, or governments, of value inhering in the documents. 72. With the growth of economic activity in late medieval and Renaissance Europe, sophisticated methods of accounting and calculating value emerged, with such calculations both carried out in writing and explained in manuals. 73. The creation of corporations then proliferated documents surrounding organization management, the distribution of shares, and record-keeping. 74. Economic theory itself only began to be developed in the latter 18th century through the writings of such theorists as François Quesnay and Adam Smith. Even the concepts of an economy and a national economy were established through their texts and the texts of their colleagues. 75. Since then, economics has developed as a field, with many authors contributing texts to the professional literature, and governments collecting data, instituting policies, and creating institutions to manage and advance their economies. Deirdre McCloskey has examined the rhetorical strategies and discursive construction of modern economics theory. 76, 77, 78. Graham Smart has examined in depth how the Bank of Canada uses writing to cooperatively produce policies based on economic data and then to communicate strategically with relevant publics. 79. Writing and religion. The identification of sacred religious texts or scriptures, often claimed to be of divine origin, codify distinct belief systems associated with particular divine texts, and became the basis of the modern concept of religion. 2. The reproduction and spread of these texts became associated with these scriptural religions, and these spread, and thus were central to proselytizing. 2. These sacred books created obligations of believers to read, or to follow the teachings of priests or priestly castes, charged with the reading, interpretation and application of these texts. Well-known examples of such scriptures are the Torah, the Bible, with its many different compilations of books of the Old and New Testaments, the Quran, the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Sutras, but there are far more religious texts through the histories of different religions, with many still in current use. These texts, because of their spread, tended to foster generalized guides for moral and ethical behavior, at least for all members of the religious community, but often these guidelines were considered applicable to all humans, as in the Ten Commandments. Writing and the law. Private legal documents for the sale of land appeared in Mesopotamia in the early 3rd millennium BCE, not long after the initial appearance of cuneiform writing. 80. The first written legal codes followed shortly thereafter around 2100 BCE, with the most well-known being the Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on stone stelae throughout Babylon circa 1750 BCE. 81. While ancient Egypt did not have codified laws, legal decrees and private contracts did appear in the Old Kingdom around 2150 BCE. The Torah, or the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, particularly Exodus and Deuteronomy, codified the laws of ancient Israel. Many other codes were to follow in Greece and Rome, with Roman law to serve as a model for church canon law and secular law throughout much of Europe during later periods. 82. 83. In China, the earliest indications of written codifications of law or books of punishments are inscriptions on bronze vessels in 536 BCE. 84. The earliest extant full set of laws dates back to the Qin and Han dynasties, which set out a full system of social control and governance, with criminal procedures and accountability for both government officials and citizens. These laws required complex reporting and documenting procedures to facilitate hierarchical supervision from the village up to the imperial center. 85. While common law developed in a mostly oral environment in England after the Romans left, with their turn of the church and then the Norman invasion, customary law began to be inscribed, as were precedents of the courts. However, many elements remained oral, with documents only memorializing public oaths, wills, land transfers, court judgments, and ceremonies. During the late medieval period, however, documents gained authority for agreements, transactions, and laws. With the founding of the United States, laws were created as statutes within written codes and controlled by central documents, including federal and state constitutions, with all such legislative documents printed and distributed. 86. Also, court arguments were presented in written opinions, which then were published and served as precedents for liasoning in consequent judgments in states and nationally. Courts of appeals in the United States only consider documents relating to records of prior proceedings and judgments and do not take new testimony. 87. Writing and government, states, bureaucracy, citizenship, and journalism. Writing has been central to expanding many of the core functions of governance through law, regulation, taxation, and documentary surveillance of citizens, all dependent on growth of bureaucracy, which elaborates and administers rules and policies and maintains records. These developments, which rely on writing, increase the power and extent of states. 2. At the same time, writing has increased the ability of citizens to become informed about the operations of the state, to become more organized in expressing needs and concerns, to identify with regions and states, and to form constituencies with particular views and interests. The rise and fate of journalism is closely linked to citizen information, regional and national identity, and expression of interests. These changes have greatly influenced the nature of states, increasing the visibility of people and their views no matter what the form of governance is. Extensive bureaucracies arose in the ancient Near East, too, and China, 88, 89, which relied on the formation of literate classes to be scribes and bureaucrats. In the ancient Near East this was carried out through the formation of scribal schools, 90, while in China this led to a series of written imperial examinations based on classic texts which in effect regulated education over millennia. 91. Literacy remained associated with rise in government bureaucracy, and printing as it emerged was tightly controlled by the government, with vernacular texts only emerging later and then being limited in their range up through the early 20th century and the fall of the Qing dynasty. 92. In ancient Greece and Rome, class distinctions of citizen and slave, wealthy and poor limited education and participation. In medieval and early modern Europe, church dominance of education, both before and for a time after the Reformation, expressed the importance of religion in the control of the state and state bureaucracies. 93. In Europe and the colonies in the Americas, the introduction of the printing press and decreasing cost of paper and printing allowed for greater access of ordinary citizens to gain information about the government and conditions in other regions within the jurisdictions. 94. The Reformation, with an emphasis on individual reading of sacred texts, eventually increased the spread of literacy beyond the governing classes and opened its door to wider knowledge and criticism of government actions. Divisions in English society during the 16th century, the Civil War of the 17th century, and the increased role of Parliament that followed, along with the splitting of political religious control. 95. Were accompanied by pamphlet wars. Newspapers and journalism, having origins in commercial information, soon was to offer political information and was instrumental to the formation of a public sphere. 96. 97. Newspapers were instrumental in the sharing of information, fostering discussion, and forming political identities in the American Revolution, and then the new nation. The circulation of newspapers also created urban, regional, and state identification in the latter 19th century and after. A focus on national news that followed telegraph and the emergence of newspapers with national circulation along with scripted national radio and television news broadcasts also created horizons of attention through the 20th century, with both benefits and costs. 98. One of the earliest known examples of a named person in writing is Kushim, from the Uruk period. 99. Writing and knowledge. Much of what we consider knowledge is inscribed in written text and is the result of communal processes of production, sharing, and evaluation among social groups and institutions bound together with the aim of producing and disseminating knowledge-bearing texts. The contemporary world identifies such social groups as disciplines and their products as disciplinary literatures. The invention of writing facilitated their sharing, comparing, criticizing, and evaluating of texts, resulting in knowledge becoming a more communal property across wider geographic and temporal domains. Sacred scriptures formed the common knowledge of scriptural religions, and knowledge of those sacred scriptures became the focus of institutions of religious belief, interpretation, and schooling, as discussed in the section on writing and religion in this article. Other sections in this article are devoted to knowledge specific to the economy, the law, and governance. This section is devoted to the development of secular knowledge and its related social organizations, institutions and educational practices in other domains. Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and Mesoamersia. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, scribes became important for roles beyond the initiating roles in the economy, governance and law. They became the producers and stewards of astronomy and calendars, divination, and literary culture. Schools developed in tablet houses, which also archived repositories of knowledge. 90. In ancient India, the Brahmin caste became stewards of texts that aggregated and codified Auric knowledge. 100. Those texts then became the authoritative basis for a continuing tradition of oral education. A case in point is the work of Pliny the linguist, who analyzed and codified knowledge of Sanskrit syntax, prosody and grammar. Mathematics, astronomy and medicine were also subjects of classic Indian learning and were codified in classic texts. 101. Less is known about Mayan, Aztec, and other Meso-Persian learning because of the destruction of texts by the conquistadors. But it is known that scribes were revered elite children, attended schools, and the study of astronomy, map-making, historical chronicles, and genealogy flourished. 102. 103. China. In China, after the Qin dynasty attempted to remove all traces of the competing Confucian tradition, the Han dynasty made philological knowledge the qualification for the government bureaucracy, so as to restore knowledge that was in danger of vanishing. The imperial civil service examination system, which was to last for 2 millennia, consisted of a written exam based on knowledge of classical texts. To support students obtaining government positions through the written examination, schools focused on those Sumer texts and the associated philological knowledge. 91. These texts covered philosophical, religious, legal, astronomical, hydrological, mathematical, military, and medical knowledge. 104. Printing as it emerged largely served the knowledge needs of the bureaucracy and the monastery, with substantial vernacular printing only emerging around the 15th century CE. 92. Ancient Greece and Rome. Ancient Greece gave rise to much written knowledge that influenced Western learning for 2 millennia. 105. Although Socrates thought writing an inferior means of transmission of learning, recounted in the Phaedrus, we know of his works through Plato's written accounts of his dialogues. Havelock, as well, has seen the philosophic works of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle as arising from literacy and the ability to compare accounts from different regions and to develop systematic critical reasoning through the inspection of documents and writing coherent accounts. 106. 107, 108. Aristotle wrote treatises and lectures which were the core of education at the Lyceum, along with the May volumes collected in the Lyceum's library. Other philosophers such as the Stoics and Epicureans also wrote and taught during the same period in Athens, although we now have only fragments of their works. Greek writers were the founding writers of many other fields of knowledge. Herodotus and Thucydides, writing during the 5th century BCE in Athens, are considered the founders of history, transforming genealogy and mythic accounts into systematic investigations of events. Thucydides developed a more critical, neutral history through the examination of documents, transcription of speeches, and interviews. Hippocrates during the same period authored several major works of medicine codifying and advancing the knowledge of this field. In the 2nd century CE, the Greek-trained physician Galen went to Rome, where he wrote numerous works that dominated European medicine through the Renaissance. Hellenized writers in Egypt also produced compendia of knowledge using the resources of the great library at Alexandria, such as Euclid, whose Elements of Geometry remains a standard reference to today. Ptolemy's work on astronomy dominated through the Middle Ages. Scholars in Rome continued the practice of writing compendia of knowledge, including Varro, Pliny the Elder, and Strabo. While much of Roman accomplishment was in material culture of construction, Vitruvius documented much of the contemporary practice to influence design until today. Agriculture also became an important area for manuals, such as Palladius' Compendium. Numerous manuals of rhetoric and rhetorical education that were to influence future generations also appeared, such as the anonymous Rhetorica ad Herennium, Cicero's De Oratoria and Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria. Islamic learning. With the fall of Rome, the Middle East became the crossroads for learning, with knowledge-bearing texts from the West and East meeting in Byzantium, Damascus, and then Baghdad. In Baghdad, a research institute, or House of Wisdom, with a large library was founded, where Greek works of medicine, philosophy, mathematics and astronomy were translated into Arabic, along with Indian works on mathematics and therapeutics. 109. To these texts, philosophers such as Al-Kindi and Avicenna and astronomers such as Al-Farqani made new contributions.